Okay, this lecture is going to cover other effects on behavior following reinforcement procedures. So we can shape behavior through reinforcement. So this is the process of teaching a complex behavior by rewarding closer and closer approximations of the desired behavior. I posted a fun little video of pigeons that were taught to play ping pong using shaping as a process. So basically, successive approximations are reinforced, which means anything close to the final behavior is reinforced, and eventually the animal engages in the behavior you want them to engage in. So a reinforcer is delivered for behaviors that approximate the target behavior. And gradually, reinforcers are provided for behaviors that more closely resemble the target behavior. So if you guys recall in the lecture I gave on operant conditioning, I showed you a cool little video of a rat I worked with where we taught the rat to pull a chain and then press the lever when the light was on. All of that was done through shaping. So for example, every time the rat looked at the chain, we gave her water. And then every time she sniffed the chain, she got water. And then every time she touched the chain, and so on and so forth, until finally she was actually pulling on the chain with both paws. So we do this using the shaping procedure. And extinction results in variability of behavior. We talked about this in the extinction lecture. And when you extinguish one of these behaviors that you've been reinforcing, new behaviors often occur. They develop, right? So for example, my rat, she was sniffing the lever for a really long time. Once we put that behavior under extinction, she starts messing with the chain, right? Because before, all she had to do was sniff it and she got water. And now she's not doing that anymore. So as part of her extinction burst, she engaged in a number of other behaviors. One of them was she accidentally touched the chain, and that's when we reinforced it. So then she learned she had to actually touch the chain, right? And you keep moving on in those approximations until they engage in the target or the final behavior that you want them to engage in, which for our rat was pulling the chain with both paws. Now, several experiments have been done. One experiment was done with a 3-year-old child with autism. This is just one of many examples. He was at risk of going blind if he failed to wear his corrective glasses, right? So he had a cataract operation where they corrected some of his vision, but he needed to wear the glasses to ensure that surgery was successful, right? So they're like a protective glasses while his eyes heal. So they did this through shaping because he's 3. They probably were not and he had autism, so he wasn't very verbal or couldn't communicate verbally. So they used shaping. So every time he touched the glasses that he had to wear, he got reinforced, right? And then after a while, every time he picked up the glasses, and then when he put the glasses on his face, and so on and so forth, until finally he was wearing the glasses in the proper position, right? So that was also done using shaping with approximate or successive approximations of the correct behavior. Another behavior that can occur from reinforcement is superstition. So, superstitious behaviors. These behaviors occur because by accident or some coincidence, it was followed by a reinforcer. And we can think of any number of behaviors that we do, that we engage in. Knocking on wood is one, right? Knock on wood. Probably because that behavior was been reinforced in the past for someone. When they knocked on wood, nothing bad happened. And they sort of get other people to do it, and so on and so forth. Superstitious behavior is what we call this. And this has actually been investigated in the lab. So B.F. Skinner was actually the first person to look at this. And he wanted to know what would happen if reinforcement was given non-contingently. So what does that mean? That means that food is delivered typically on a time-based schedule. The organism does not have to engage in any behavior at all. So let's say every 10 seconds, we're going to deliver reinforcer, whether or not the individual behaves. And you would think they would just sit there, right, and get their reinforcer, but they don't. they engage in a number of behaviors. And in fact, they start engaging in the exact same behavior every time. We call it superstitious behavior. So B.F. Skinner actually took 8 pigeons who were food deprived, right? That's how you get them to work for food. And he delivered food pellets, which was the reinforcer, on a fixed time schedule of 30 seconds. So every 30 seconds, food was given to the pigeon regardless of what they were doing. Okay. They could have just stood there and done nothing, and they still would have gotten the food at the end of 30 seconds. But what he found was that 6 out of the 8 birds actually developed clearly defined operants, which means they engaged in very specific behaviors right before the food was delivered. So one was turning in a circle anti-clockwise. One was like pushing its head into the upper corner of the chamber, would like shove its head up in the corner. One was like rocking his head up and down significantly, like way up high and way down low. Another one was like pecking this very specific spot on the floor, and so on. So what was happening, right? So the pigeon probably engaged in that behavior once, and it just so happened that they engaged in that behavior at the end of 30 seconds, which was when reinforcement was delivered. And so they engaged in that behavior again, and maybe it was reinforced again. And that's how that superstitious behavior came to be or started occurring. But the pigeon could have just stood there and done nothing. But none of the pigeons did that, right? They engaged in very specific behaviors that they associated with reinforcement. And we as humans, like I said, engage in all kinds of superstitious behaviors, especially around sports, right? There's all sorts of different moves people do, or they have to use like a specific water bottle or turn it the certain way, or, they have to like touch their bat. Like baseball players, they'll do this like bat click thing on their heels and their shoulder. They do this like whole thing, right? This whole ritual to get ready before they bat. People will wear the same shirt to all of their home team's games, right? Their lucky shirt, something like that. This is superstitious behavior. At one point or another, that behavior was reinforced, and now individuals continue engaging in it, even if it's not reinforced again, right? Even if your team loses, you'll probably still wear your lucky shirt every time your team plays. That's superstitious behavior. I posted a couple of videos for you guys to watch. They're just fun little videos. You don't have to watch them, but they're kind of interesting to watch. One is the pigeon one, but there's another video that shows this happening with humans and all of the things they come up with in terms of what behavior they have to engage in to get the reinforcement. It's pretty funny to watch if you have a few minutes. Okay. So again, we have the law of effect, and you would expect in situations where behavior is reinforced and the reinforcers are not caused by the behavior, but they're merely followed by chance, right? So what's happening here is, remember we talked about the law of effect and the temporal contiguity of things, where the reinforcer is delivered after a behavior and that behavior is reinforced. So that's kind of what you're expecting, right? And with temporal law, that the behavior occurs and then it's reinforced sometime close to how it happens. But when we're talking about superstitious behavior, it just so happens that the reinforcer is delivered after the behavior. It's adventitious reinforcement is what we call it, resulting in superstitious behavior, okay? So it's basically just that the reinforcer is delivered by chance. It just so happens that the reinforcer followed that behavior, but it's not that that reinforcer was delivered for the behavior on purpose, right? It's not that we made sure that your team won the game because you wore your shirt, right? It just so happens that by luck, your team happened to win and you happen to be wearing your lucky shirt. It's adventitious reinforcement. And because of that, you engage in superstitious behavior of wearing your team's or wearing your lucky shirt every time your team plays. And again, this has been studied in humans pretty extensively. This is an old study that was done with children, and they did an experiment with a mechanical clown, which is kind of scary. Most kids are scared of clowns. I know I was when I was a child, so it's odd. But all of these old experiments, they seem to use clowns, which I find very interesting. But basically, it dispensed these little marbles every 30 seconds or 60 seconds, and no response was required. So again, all the child had to do was sit there, and they would get these little marbles that they could essentially turn in for like M&Ms or something like that, or they could play with or whatever. 75% of the children developed a particular response that they were emitting before the reinforcement was delivered. So they were either grimacing or like kind of making this horrible face at the clown, or they'd even like punch or hit the mechanical clown. So again, they probably engaged in some form of this behavior, and it just so happened that they engaged in that behavior at the right moment and reinforcement was delivered. And as a result, they thought, well, that's what I have to do to get the mark, right? So then they start engaging in that behavior. But really, all they had to do was sit there the entire time. Now, there's something called motivating operations that also can affect your behavior. So, a motivating operation is anything that increases or decreases the value of a reinforcer. And we have what are called establishing and abolishing operations. So establishing operations, they increase the likelihood that you'll engage in behaviors that have been reinforced with whatever you're trying to get. And it also increases the value of the reinforcer. So this is when we're talking about states of deprivation, right? So if you're really hungry, if you're starving, you're more likely to engage in behaviors that have resulted in finding food, whatever that may be, whether it be walking to your kitchen, going to the fridge, asking your friend for food because they always have snacks. And it also increases food, the value of food as a reinforcer. So maybe food, having like a big burger doesn't really sound that great when you're hungry. But when you're hungry, that reinforcer is really valuable, right? You really want it. So when we're talking about motivating operations, the motivating operation changes the value of the reinforcer, and it also changes the likelihood of the behaviors that will occur. So establishing happens when you're in deprivation mode, and it increases, okay? Increases your behaviors and increases the value of the reinforcer. Abolishing is the opposite. Occurs during satiation. So if you're not hungry anymore, you already ate. So you had a nice big burger and fries and a milkshake. You're now satiated, right? So now the value of food as a reinforcer decreases. It's not valuable anymore because you're not hungry. And all of the behaviors you engaged in to get the food don't occur anymore, right? They're less likely to occur because you don't want food anymore. You're not hungry or you're satiated. So motivating operations are also something that are going on in the environment in your own internal personal environment, right? That certainly affect your behaviors. So sometimes we can't always look at the external environment. We need to also consider the internal environment of the individual and the motivating operations that are constantly in flux in your body, right? You're constantly either hungry or satiated, and it goes back and forth, right? Over time, you get hungry again, and then you're satiated, and so on and so forth. So we certainly have to take these into account when we're talking about effects on behavior. Stimulus control is another process that can also affect when and if a behavior is going to occur. So stimulus control is referring to the degree to which the presence of a stimulus, so the presence of some stimulus in the environment, will affect whether or not the behavior is emitted in its presence. So in this example, of course, you see a red and a green light. So are you going to push on the gas pedal when you're at a red light? No, you're only going to push on a gas pedal in the presence of the green light. That's stimulus control, right? Your behavior of pressing on the drive pedal only occurs in the presence of a green light. You've learned this, right, through driving school and your experience of being a driver. And you've also learned that your behavior of pressing on the gas pedal is not going to be reinforced in the presence of that red light, right? You're either going to get a ticket or you might get in an accident. Okay, so that's stimulus control. So again, sometimes a behavior will only be emitted in a very specific stimulus condition. So when we're talking about the red and green light, we're talking about discrimination. Okay, that's what we refer to when a response only occurs in the presence of one stimulus, but does not occur in the presence of other stimuli. Okay, so you only press the gas pedal in the presence of the green light, but not in the presence of the red light. Stimulus control. Other times, the behavior will appear in a variety of similar stimulus situations. We refer to this as generalization. It's when the same response occurs in other environments or in the presence of other stimuli. A good example of this is when parents teach their kids to say please and thank you. Most likely, they teach their kids in the presence of only them, right? In the presence of mom and dad. But then when the child is in the presence of another adult, so this is a similar stimulus to their parents, right? It's another adult person. When they want something, they may also say please and thank you, right? So their response of saying please and thank you has generalized to different stimuli of other human adults. Okay, and then it probably generalizes even more to other human children, right, that are like them, and so on. This is just the generalization versus discrimination continuum. So as you see on the left, you have all the way on the left, you have discrimination. So that's when the organism only responds to the stimulus that was used in training and nothing else, right? No generalization. And then on the right-hand side, we have generalization where the organism responds equally to all stimuli and there's no discrimination in place. And you kind of have all kinds of different responding across the continuum. But that's the difference between discrimination and generalization. So make sure you understand those distinctions. And then finally, we have something called observational learning. So just like it sounds, this is when you learn to engage in a response by watching somebody else, right? Your responding or your behavior is influenced by observing others, observing a model, right? Observing somebody else engage in the same behavior. And if they're reinforced, then you're more likely to engage in the behavior as well so that you can receive reinforcement. Or if they're punished, you're less likely to engage in that same behavior so that you don't receive the same punishment. So this we refer to as observational learning. It's the same process as other learnings, but it's vicarious learning. So it just means that you learn through somebody else, right? Not through your own experience. So in reinforcement or shaping or extinction, you're directly exposed to the contingency of receiving the reinforcer or not, right? You engage in the behavior and you receive the reinforcer, or you engage in the behavior and you experience the punishment. But this is through somebody else. You watch someone else engage in that behavior, and then you are more likely or less likely, depending on the consequence of their behavior, going to engage in the same thing. And this is an explanation for why physical punishment tends to increase aggression behavior in children. So that's another drawback of using punishment is often children who are whose parents use corporal punishment, so things like spanking, they're more likely to engage in aggressive behaviors when they're around other children or at school because, again, observational learning, right? They've watched their parents engage in this behavior, so they engage in the behavior themselves. And there's 4 key processes that have been stated in the literature that are going on here. So the first is attention. So you're paying attention to other people's behaviors and its consequences, right? So you're looking at the behavior the individual engage in, but you're also seeing what comes after it. Does that individual contact some sort of reinforcement or do they contact some sort of punishment? Okay, so you're paying attention to the whole contingency of the behavior and the consequence that follows. Retention is also another process. So either you emit the behavior, so you have the occasion to emit the behavior, which basically means even right after that person engages in it, you might engage in that behavior. And you see children doing this a lot. I especially watch this all the time with my children, right? Their siblings. So my son will often watch his older sister engage in certain behaviors when they were really little and we used to go to the playground, right? She would climb the ladder to get to the slide. He would watch her, and then immediately after, he would engage in the same behavior. So he would emit the behavior right after her. Or you have to remember the behavior, right? And when we talk about remembering, it's more that you are controlled by the environmental variables that are happening. So when you're in the same environment, you're more likely to emit that behavior that you observed previously in that environment, right? So you retain that information, those same environmental variables in place, and then you emit the behavior. Reproduction is another process, so you have to be able to physically reproduce the behavior. The example of my children at the park, so when my son was very little, they're 4 years apart, my kids. So when my daughter was 6, he was only 2. So she was doing a lot of things he couldn't do. For example, getting on the swing and swinging herself. He would sit on the swing, poor little guy, and he would just kick his legs out like she was, but of course the swing's not moving, right? He doesn't really have the physical capability to like lean backwards and push your feet out and then lean forward and pull your feet in, right? He's not quite old enough. He doesn't have the dexterity yet to control the swing the way a 6-year-old does. So you do have to have the physical ability that's required for you to be able to reproduce some behaviors. And then finally, motivation. So you need a situation in which the behavior is actually going to be favorable, right? So typically, maybe there's some sort of motivating operation. So, I might be at a restaurant and my husband orders a really big meal because he's really hungry, but I might not do that because I'm not that hungry, right? So motivation becomes a key role here, or plays a key role in this process, where you have to be in a situation where your behavior is favorable, right? Where you want the reinforcer that you're actually behaving for. And we also look at this in terms of stimulus control too. If you're somewhere where you shouldn't be engaging the behavior, so let's say the red light, green light, and the car next to you pushes the gas pedal, you're probably not going to do that either because your behavior is not favorable in that condition, right? And the Bobo doll experiment was a big experiment back in the 80s that they looked at this observational learning specifically. There have been many studies on imitation and generalized imitation, but the Bobo doll experiment is the most well known. So basically, in this experiment, they had 2 groups of children watch a video of an adult engaging in interactions with this Bobo doll, right? So in one group, they watched the adult engaging in aggressive behaviors towards the blow-up doll. Both groups observed them engaging in aggressive behaviors toward the doll. So the adults are punching the doll. It's like this big blow up thing. When you hit it, it pops back up. So they're hitting it, they're yelling at it, so on and so forth. So the children are watching the video of this adult. And half of the children see the adult contact some sort of positive consequence for this behavior. And some of the children see the adult get negative consequences, right? So the adult like gets in trouble for acting aggressively towards the Bobo doll. And then they had a control group as well who didn't see a video at all, right? They just saw the Bobo doll and that was it. And what happened was those children that saw the 2 videos, so you've got 3 groups essentially, but group 1 is split into 2. So half of those children that saw the adult play with the Bobo doll aggressively, they now put those children in the room with the Bobo doll, and there's no consequences for their behavior. So those children that saw the adults get reinforced, they're not going to get reinforcement. And those children that saw the adults get punished, those children are not going to be punished. They're merely put in a room with the Bobo doll and let's see what they do. Those children who watched the adults get reinforced for acting aggressively towards the Bobo doll were more likely to aggress towards the doll, okay? So if they saw adults, if they observed adults getting reinforced for their behavior, those children were much more likely to engage in aggressive behaviors themselves. And the children that saw the adults being punished, they were much less likely to engage in aggressive behaviors as well. And that is the end for other effects on behavior.